November 26, 1943. Skies above Bremen, Germany. The pencil trembled slightly as Major Francis Gabreski noted the moment in his flight log after landing. Words that would have sounded absurd just 8 months earlier, when even seasoned IAF pilots doubted that the massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolt could hold its own against agile German fighters. The Luftwaffe will learn to fear the dive, he had written. They had discovered a secret no German pilot could match. Through the frost-rimmed canopy at 28,000 feet, Gabreski had watched his squadron perform a maneuver that upended every lesson of First World War dogfighting. Instead of turning horizontally to meet the enemy, they rolled inverted and plunged straight down, hitting speeds near 500 miles per hour, fast enough to tear the wings off most fighters in Europe. The Messerschmitt Bf-110s never saw their killers coming. One moment they were climbing confidently toward the vulnerable Boeing B-17 flying fortresses. The next, 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns shredded their fuselages from a P-47 that seemed to appear from the sun itself, a true thunderbolt from Zeus. The arithmetic of air superiority was being rewritten not through turn rate or climb, but through the brutal physics of a 4-ton fighter hurtling toward terminal velocity, then using that kinetic energy to rocket back upward. At high altitude, where thin air and turbocharging favored the Americans, Gabreski's unit held the advantage. That day he downed 2 Bf-110s, earning the Distinguished Service Cross for protecting the bomber stream. The transformation had begun on April 13, 1943, when the 56th Fighter Group flew its first mission, a sweep over Saint-Omer in occupied France. The pilots were tense. After 8 months training on the Thunderbolt, many still doubted it. Fully loaded, it weighed nearly 14,000 pounds, and with external stores reached 17,500 pounds, the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built. It outweighed the graceful Supermarine Spitfire by 4,000 pounds and the Focke-Wulf FW-190 by 3,000. Critics mocked it as a milk bottle, later shortened to the jug. Our AF veterans who had saved Britain in light Spitfires could not imagine such a brute surviving against experienced Luftwaffe pilots. Among the skeptics was Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, newly trained and convinced he would die in his first week. His later memoir, written with Martin Kading, chronicled aviation's great turning point, from doubt to dominance. The story began at Republic Aviation's plant in Farmingdale, Long Island, where Polish-American engineer Alexander Kartveli designed something radically different from anything before it. After the XP-44 project was cancelled, he famously sketched a P-47 concept on a train, joking later there was a dinosaur, but a well-proportioned dinosaur. The aircraft was built around the mighty Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower at sea level, boosted to 2,300 with water injection. Later variants such as the P-47M reached 2,800 horsepower, ranking among the most powerful piston engines ever flown. This immense output ran through an advanced turbo-supercharger system buried deep in the fuselage, the secret to the P-47's astonishing performance. Exhaust gases coursed along both sides of the cockpit to drive a General Electric turbine spinning at 21,300 RPM. That turbine compressed air, cooled it through an intercooler, and fed it back to the engine, allowing full power even at 27,000 feet. At 30,000 feet, where other fighters suffocated, the Thunderbolt still roared with life. It could operate up to 42,000 feet, an altitude where German aircraft faltered. But such capability came at a cost. The complex turbo system, heavy armor, including a 69-pound headrest plate and reinforced seat armor, self-sealing fuel tanks carrying 370 gallons, and 8 Browning M2 machine guns with 3,400 rounds combined to form a beast many thought too heavy to ever turn or climb well in combat. Yet in Gabreski's log that cold November day, it was clear the jug had rewritten the laws of air war. Fully loaded, the Thunderbolt's weight alone exceeded 9,900 pounds, and in combat configuration, it pushed past 14,000 pounds even before external stores were attached. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson later wrote of his first mission on April 13th, "I could see the challenge ahead. The Germans had been at war for years. We were flying an aircraft many thought unsuited for this fight. Yet Colonel Zemke believed we would prove otherwise." Through late April and into May 1943, the 56th Fighter Group flew cautiously, short sweeps over the French coast, learning terrain, testing systems, and gaining confidence before facing the enemy head-on. The real trial came on June 12, 1943, during Mission IAF Rodeo 204 along the Belgian coast. Captain Walter V. Cook of the 61st Fighter Squadron sighted a Focke-Wulf FW-190 below near Blankenberge. Following the altitude advantage tactics drilled by Colonel Hubert Zemke, Cook rolled into a dive, fired his .50 caliber machine guns, and watched the FW-190 burst into smoke and plunge earthward. It was a 56th's first confirmed kill, one through the steep diving attack that would become its deadly signature. The very next day, June 13, 1943, brought 3 more victories, confirming Zemke's approach. Lieutenant Johnson scored his first kill that day, diving from altitude onto another FW-190 near Bruges, France. The German never saw him coming. Johnson's short bow struck home, and the fighter spiraled into the ground. On landing, Major General Carl Spaatz, commander of the 8th Air Force, personally handed him a bottle of scotch to mark the occasion, one of the first Thunderbolt victories in Europe. Yet triumph carried a lesson. Johnson's element leader failed to cover him, leaving him alone against multiple German fighters. Despite his success, Johnson was reprimanded by his commanders, including Zemke, Gabreski, and Captain Gerald W. Johnson, for breaking formation. The incident underlined a vital truth. Diving attacks demanded discipline, coordination, and mutual protection. Individual glory meant nothing if a pilot was lost after scoring kill. But nothing in those early European sorties prepared the group for what had already been discovered months earlier during testing in the United States. On November 13, 1942, long before the 56th deployed, Lieutenant Harold Comstock and Roger Dyer pushed their P-47 CS into near-vertical dives from 35,000 feet. What they encountered would define the aircraft's combat envelope. Their airspeed indicators climbed past 500 miles per hour, then 600, eventually registering an astonishing 725 miles per hour indicated. In truth, their actual speed was likely nearer 550 to 600 miles per hour, as pitot-static instruments became unreliable in the thin, high-altitude air. Republic Aviation briefly claimed the pilots had broken the sound barrier, the first humans to do so, but this was soon challenged by experts. General Henry Hap Arnold quickly issued an order forbidding further mention of the claim. Post-war analysis confirmed that no piston-engine aircraft of the era exceeded Mach 0.92, the record held jointly by modified Spitfire and later model Thunderbolts. Still, what Comstock and Dyer experienced in those dives proved crucial. Beyond roughly 550 miles per hour indicated, the P-47 entered a regime of compressibility. Airflow over parts of the wing approached the speed of sound, creating shock wave that locked the controls solid. The pilots found themselves in uncontrollable dives, vision narrowing from G-forces as they hurtled toward the Earth. Recovery seemed impossible. Yet both men survived, discovering through desperate improvisation the method that would save countless lives afterward. Their solution, later formalized by pilots like Charles D. Moore, was counterintuitive. Apply steady, two-handed forward pressure on the control stick, keeping the trim tab strictly neutral. Adjusting trim in this regime could be fatal. Once the aircraft descended into thicker air, the controls would suddenly free, and any overcorrection could rip the wings apart. The correct recovery required calm persistence, maintaining constant manual force as a Thunderbolt plunged through the compressibility zone. Below roughly 15,000 feet, in denser air, control returned abruptly, and the Jug, battered but unbroken, would obediently pull out of its dive, ready to climb again toward the thin blue edge of combat. As the Thunderbolt descended through denser air, compressibility effects would gradually fade, and the elevators would slowly regain responsiveness. The aircraft began to answer the controls again, allowing the pilot to complete recovery. Both Comstock and Dyer leveled out with less than 2,000 feet remaining, their bodies crushed against their seats under 7 to 8 GS. When they landed and reported the ordeal to Republic Aviation and Wright Field engineers, the reaction was immediate and methodical. From that point onward, every P-47 pilot received thorough instruction on recognizing the onset of compressibility and performing the correct recovery procedure. Engineers soon discovered something equally important. The Thunderbolt stick elliptical wing, once criticized for limiting turn performance, actually postponed the onset of critical compressibility. It could dive faster and recover more safely than any fighter in the sky. Later P-47D models would incorporate dive recovery flaps, small retractable surfaces under the wings that stabilize the aircraft in high-speed dives and ease recovery from compressibility. This innovation proved vital in combat. Throughout May and June 1943, Colonel Hubert Zemke relentlessly drilled his group in tactics tailored to the Thunderbolt's unique strengths. Climb high, 30,000 feet or more, before entering hostile territory. Keep formation tight for mutual cover. Never pursue enemies into low altitude, where the P-47's bulk and sluggish acceleration became disadvantages. When a target appeared below, roll inverted to keep visual contact, pull forward to 5 GS, and dive at full throttle. The resulting speed, often above 480 miles per hour and occasionally exceeding 500 miles per hour, made the Thunderbolt nearly impossible to escape. A short burst from its 8.50 caliber Brownings, each cycling around 800 rounds per minute, unleashed roughly 6,400 rounds per minute, over 100 bullets per second. Even a 2-second burst tore enemy aircraft apart. Then, before the enemy could counterattack, the pilot would pull up hard, using the stored kinetic energy to climb back to altitude within a minute. Skepticism lingered, though many pilots still clung to the traditional notion of air combat, tight-turning fights rather than slashing attacks. Some questioned whether diving away could really be called fighting. On June 26, 1943, that debate turned deadly. 48 P-47CS of the 56th Fighter Group escorting B-17 bombers returning from Villers-Courbet, France, were jumped by 16 Focke-Wulf FW-190s of Jadjish 26 Near-Forges Lezos. The clash proved both costly and transformative. Lieutenant Johnson's P-47C, Half-Pint, was hit early in the engagement by multiple 20mm cannon shells. His canopy shattered, hydraulic lines burst, drenching the cockpit in fluid, and a brief fire ignited behind the instrument panel. Shrapnel struck Johnson's face, leaving him bleeding and half-dazed. Most men would have bailed out, but the canopy jammed shut. Trapped, Johnson shoved the nose down and dove toward the English Channel, the FW-190 still hammering him with cannon fire. More shells ripped through the wings and fuselage until the German pilot, having exhausted his ammunition, pulled alongside, saluted, and turned away. Whether it was admiration or resignation, Johnson never knew. Amazingly, the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine kept running. The Thunderbolt's thick armor, redundant hydraulics, and rugged internal structure held together despite catastrophic damage. Johnson limped across the channel and spotted RAF Manston's emergency strip. Nearly blind through a fluid-smeared windscreen, he brought Half-Pint in for a flawless landing. Ground crews counted over 200 holes in the A-frame, without completing a full circuit. The right wing spars were nearly severed, the fuselage peppered with fist-sized gaps, and all hydraulics were gone. Yet Johnson escaped with only superficial shrapnel wounds, and, incredibly, Half-Pint was repaired and returned to service. That mission cost the 56-4 aircraft and 4 pilots, their worst single loss thus far. Yet it also proved beyond argument what Zemke's men were beginning to grasp. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not merely powerful. It was indestructible. Its resilience and diving prowess would soon change the course of aerial warfare. The truth of that came on August 17, 1943, during the legendary Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, when the 8th Air Force dispatched 376 heavy bombers on a daring double strike deep into Germany. It was there, in the thin blue above Bavaria, that the Thunderbolt's tactics and its legend would be fully vindicated. The August 17th mission targeted the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt production lines at Regensburg, deep inside Germany. The bombers would have to fly hundreds of miles beyond the normal range of Allied escort fighters. The P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group were tasked with a penetration escort for the Regensburg force, covering the bombers as far as their fuel would carry them before turning back to England. Major Francis Gabreski led elements of the 61st Fighter Squadron, positioning his flights at 30,000 feet, roughly 5,000 feet above the bomber stream. From multiple bases across northern France and Belgium, German interceptors were already climbing to meet the formation. Nearly 40 Bf-109s and FW-190s rising in coordinated waves. Their timing were precise, to strike the bombers just as the P-47s approached fuel limits. What the Luftwaffe pilots did not anticipate was a coordinated, high-altitude counterattack that followed. In perfect unison, several Thunderbolt flights rolled inverted, dove at steep 45 to 60-degree angles, and accelerated toward the enemy at speeds German pilots had never encountered from American fighters. For 20 chaotic minutes, combat raged across 70 miles of sky. The P-47 struck hard in textbook diving attacks, then climbed back to altitude to repeat the maneuver. The 56 fighter group claimed 16 German aircraft destroyed, 9 damaged, and 1 probable, losing only 3 of their own. German records later confirmed 22 aircraft lost across several units, with 11 pilots killed and 8 wounded. Among the dead was Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Goland, Gruppen commander of 2 Jagdgeschwader 26, and brother to General Adolf Goland. Wilhelm Goland had scored 55 victories before falling to a Thunderbolt attack he never saw coming. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin of the 56 was credited with a probable kill, diving from altitude at over 480 miles per hour and raking Galland's FW-190 with a short, deadly boast. The German fighter exploded in midair. Galland's remains were found months later, still strapped in his seat, driven 12 feet into the soil by the impact. The psychological blow to Jagdgeschwader 26 was immense, their veteran leader killed by an enemy tactic they could not counter. More importantly, bomber losses were far lower than predicted during the window of P-47 escort. The Thunderbolt had proven it could shield the heavy bombers hammering Germany's industrial core. By October 1943, these tactics had matured into a finely honed doctrine, producing kill ratios once thought impossible. The month's missions demonstrated what discipline, altitude advantage, and superior firepower could achieve. On October 4th, during an escort to Frankfurt, the 56 encountered around 60 German fighters attacking the bomber stream near Cologne. Employing their perfected diving tactics, the Thunderbolt pilots destroyed 15 twin-engine Bf-110s and several single-engine interceptors. 16 total victories for the loss of only 2 P-47s, both to anti-aircraft fire. 4 days later, on October 8th, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, flying as Captain Gerald W. Johnson's wingman, executed another flawless boom and zoom strike. At 29,000 feet over Bremen, he spotted an FW-190 stalking another Thunderbolt. Johnson rolled inverted, pulled 4 GS, and dived at full emergency power. At 26,000 feet and 460 miles per hour, he opened fire. 8.50 caliber guns converged, shredding the German aircraft. Pieces tore free as it spiraled downward. Without hesitation, Johnson pulled up into a steep zoom climb, regaining 3,000 feet in half a minute and returning to formation within 60 seconds. The entire attack, from roll-in to recovery, took less than a minute, a perfect display of the Thunderbolt's new fighting style. 2 days later, October 10th, 1943, Johnson became an ace during a massive engagement over Munster. His squadron intercepted about 40 German fighters striking withdrawing B-17s. In the violent dogfight that followed, Johnson performed 3 separate diving attacks in 25 minutes, destroying a Messerschmitt Bf-109, a twin-engine Bf-110, and a Focke-Wulf FW-190 escort, 5 confirmed victories in total. Unbeknownst to him, one of his kills that day was Oberstleutnant Hans Philipp, commander of Jagdgeschwader 1, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated aces with 206 victories, 177 on the Eastern Front and 29 in the West. Johnson would only learn the identity of his fallen opponent half a century later when historians compared combat records. But that triumph came at a cost. On his final attack run, Johnson's P-47D was hit by 20mm fire from a Bf-110's rear gunner. Explosions ripped through his right wing and fuselage, destroying hydraulics and crippling controls. Smoke filled the cockpit as hydraulic fluid drained away. Pointing his damaged fighter toward the channel, Johnson began what would become one of the longest and most harrowing flights of his life. German fighters soon recognized a wounded Thunderbolt and closed in for the kill. 3 times FW-190 swooped in to finish off Johnson's crippled aircraft, and 3 times he forced a nose down, pushing through vibration and damage to reach more than 400 miles per hour, each time pulling away from his pursuers. Even half-destroyed, the P-47D could still outdive any German fighter. Nursing the smoking aircraft across Belgium and over the Channel, Johnson descended steadily, losing altitude as fuel and hydraulics bled away. He spotted an emergency airfield and managed a flawless landing despite near-frozen controls and barely any forward visibility. When the ground crews inspected the plane, they were astonished. The P-47D carried over 200 bullet and cannon holes. The right wing had lost much of its internal strength, with multiple longerons severed, and the fuselage was torn open down to critical systems. Yet the great Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine had kept running, losing only one or two cylinders. The A-frame had stayed intact through punishment that would have destroyed any other fighter. Johnson climbed from the wreck unharmed, and after repairs, the Thunderbolt was returned to combat service. Those missions in October 1943 proved something as vital as the boom and zoom tactics themselves, the P-47 fusion of offensive striking power and defensive endurance. It could hit harder, survive longer, and bring its pilot home even when riddled with holes. This gave Thunderbolt crews a kind of fearless confidence that transformed their performance in battle. By November 1943, the 56 Fighter Group's doctrine had spread across the 8th Air Force. Every P-47 unit was taught to think vertically. Altitude meant life. Speed meant survival. Discipline meant victory. Never descend to the enemy's level unless bomber protection demanded it. Never turn when you could dive. Never fight fair when you could attack from advantage. The numbers told the story. From June to December 1943, as tactics matured and experience grew, the 56 achieved kill-to-loss ratios near 11-to-1 in air combat. Including all causes, mechanical failure, weather, and flak, the ratio still exceeded 5-to-1. In engagements where pilots held altitude discipline and strictly followed diving doctrine, the ratio sometimes topped 15-to-1, occasionally reaching 20-to-1 under ideal conditions. The method worked because it leveraged unchangeable physics rather than pilot bravado. P-47 at 30,000 feet possessed nearly 9.4 million foot-pounds of potential energy. Diving to 20,000 feet converted that into kinetic force, propelling it to speeds near 500 miles per hour. No German fighter could safely match that. The FW-190 reached structural danger near 450 miles per hour. The Bf-109 faced similar speed limits and lost control authority in dives. After striking at 20,000 feet, a Thunderbolt pilot could pull forward to 5 GS, zoom climb back to 28,000 or 29,000 feet, and reset for another run, all within 90 seconds, using minimal fuel. A German fighter, climbing from 20,000 to 30,000 feet, required 4 to 6 minutes and burned heavily while losing power in thinning air. By late 1943 and into early 1944, the psychological toll on Luftwaffe pilots became clear. German report began noting a reluctance to engage P-47s above 25,000 feet. Some squadrons avoided high-altitude combat entirely, preferring to attack bombers during their climb or descent when escort coverage was thinner, yet this exposed them to defensive fire and reduced their success rate. Major Karl Gotz, who briefly commanded 2 Jagdgeschwader 11 from April 19 to May 12, 1944, before being shot down and wounded, later described the shift in perspective. In post-war interviews, he admitted that by late 1943, veteran German pilots fully understood the Thunderbolt's danger when flown with discipline. American aviators had learned to exploit its true design, refusing to descend into turning fights, attacking only from above, and diving at such extraordinary speed that they were almost invisible in motion. When German fighters climbed to meet them, the Thunderbolts simply climbed higher, using their superior high-altitude power. The Luftwaffe's only partial counter was to strike bombers quickly from below and flee before the P-47s could dive on them, but even this desperate tactic came at a terrible price. German pilots had less time to aim accurately, and bomber defensive fire proved far more lethal against attacks from below. Major Rohl, who survived the war with 275 confirmed victories, the third highest total in aviation history, later served in the West German Luftwaffe from 1956 to 1975. The Thunderbolt's diving tactics demanded not only precision but also exceptional physical conditioning. Pulling out of a 500 miles per hour dive generated forces exceeding 7 times gravity. Blood drained from the brain to the legs, vision constricted into a narrow tunnel, and some pilots even blacked out momentarily at the bottom of their dives, regaining consciousness only as the aircraft leveled out on its own. To combat this, P-47 pilots adopted anti-G techniques borrowed from dive bomber crews. They would tense their leg and abdominal muscles violently during pullouts to keep blood pressure elevated and prevent fainting. Grunting or shouting forced air pressure into the lungs and chest cavity, helping sustain oxygen to the brain. Training emphasized limiting recovery pools to around 6 to 6.5 GS, shallow enough to reduce blackout risk while still retaining enough speed for an efficient zoom climb. Youth, fitness, and discipline kept most pilots conscious and capable, but the toll accumulated. Pilots returning from multiple high-intensity sorties in a day were physically spent, muscles aching from repeated high-G maneuvers. Some suffered temporary vision loss or chronic back pain from spinal compression caused by the repeated strain of pullouts. The winter of 1943 to 44 brought harsher tests as bombing missions penetrated deeper into Germany's industrial heartland. On January 11, 1944, during a mission to Eschursleben, the 56th Fighter Group faced over 100 German fighters determined to annihilate the bomber stream. The battle raged for nearly an hour across 150 miles of sky. Major Gabreski, now the group's operations officer, led from 29,000 feet, executing 6 separate diving attacks, destroying 3 enemy fighters and damaging 2 more. His combat report called it the most ferocious fight yet. Thunderbolts and German fighters locked in swirling duels that consumed thousands of rounds and nearly all available fuel. That day, the 56 claimed 22 German aircraft destroyed for the loss of 4 Thunderbolts, 3 to enemy fire, 1 to mechanical failure. A 5.5 to 1 kill ratio, slightly below average but remarkable considering the scale of the engagement. More importantly, bomber losses were drastically reduced. Only 5 B-17s were shot down while P-47s were on station, compared with far heavier losses on unescorted legs. This confirmed that the real measure of success was not just kills, it was protection. February 1944 ushered in Operation Argument, known among the crews as Big Week. 6 days of relentless bombing between February 20th and 25th targeting German aircraft factories. The 8-day force flew over 3,000 heavy bomber sorties, while the Luftwaffe threw every fighter it had into the sky. The 56th Fighter Group flew 16 major missions during and after Big Week, logging more combat hours than any other unit. Their diving tactics, refined over 9 months, were now wielded by hardened veterans against an increasingly inexperienced enemy. The results were catastrophic for Germany. During Big Week, in the first half of March 1944, the 56 destroyed roughly 8 to 7 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, a record-shattering performance. On February 20th, during the Leipzig escort, they downed 15 fighters without loss. On February 22nd, 12 more over Halberstadt. The cumulative effect was devastating. The Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace in daylight collapsed. German units were bleeding pilots faster than replacements could be trained. New recruits arrived with barely 50 flight hours, many having never fired guns in mock combat, while American pilots typically had 150 to 200 hours before seeing action. These green Luftwaffe pilots stood little chance. They failed to spot Thunderbolts diving from the stratosphere, reacted too slowly, or panicked and dove away, playing directly into the P-47's greatest advantage. By March 1944, the balance of power in the air had decisively shifted. German interceptors still appeared, but in fewer numbers and with waning aggression. On March 6, 1944, the 56th Fighter Group escorted bombers all the way to Berlin and back without meeting a single enemy willing to engage at high altitude. After months of brutal losses, the Luftwaffe had learned the hard truth. Fighting Thunderbolts above 25,000 feet was tantamount to suicide. P-47 pilots, now veterans of a transformed air war, began transitioning. By early 1944, the P-47 began transitioning increasingly into the fighter-bomber role, carrying 500 and 1,000-pound bombs or high-velocity aircraft rockets for ground attack missions. Yet even in this new capacity, its diving capability remained essential. Thunderbolt pilots would loiter at 25,000 feet or higher, spot railway yards, truck convoys, or fuel depots below, roll inverted, and plunge in dives exceeding 60 degrees. They release their ordnance between 4,000 and 6,000 feet, then zoom climb back to safety before anti-aircraft gunners could track their descent. The same physics that made the P-47 a terror in air combat made it equally lethal as a fighter bomber. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, who became the top American ace in the European theater, scored his final victory on July 5, 1944, bringing his total to 28 kills, all in P-47 Thunderbolts with a 56 fighter group. 15 days later, on July 20th, his luck ended. While strafing the Bassenheim airfield at low altitude, his propeller struck the ground, forcing him to crash land inside German territory. Captured, he spent the final 9 months of the war as a prisoner. In later interviews, Gabreski always credited Colonel Hubert Zemke's diving attack doctrine for the 56th's unmatched record. When we first arrived in England in early 1943, he recalled, most of us thought the P-47 was too big and too clumsy. British pilots said we wouldn't last a week, and for a while they might have been right. But once Zemke taught us to stop turning with the Germans and start fighting vertically, everything changed. We used our real strengths, altitude, speed, and ruggedness. We struck from above and escaped before the enemy could react. Suddenly, we were winning. The plane we once doubted became our greatest advantage. Robert S. Johnson, who completed 91 combat missions and finished with 27 confirmed victories, became the first USAF pilot in Europe to surpass Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26. Rotated home in May 1944, Johnson spent the rest of the war training new pilots and promoting war bonds. In his memoir Thunderbolt, co-authored with Martin Kading, he emphasized that courage alone was never enough. Flying skill matters, but tactics based on your aircraft strengths matter more. A mediocre pilot using the right doctrine will always defeat an expert using the wrong one. The statistics proved him right. From April 1943 through April 1945, the 56 Fighter Group flew 447 combat missions, claiming 674.5 confirmed victories, more than any other 8-day force fighter group. According to U.S. Air Force Historical Study No. 85, they lost only 60 aircraft in aerial combat, achieving an astonishing 11.2 to 1 kill ratio. Including all losses, mechanical failures, weather, flak, and accidents, the ratio still stood at 5.3 to 1. These numbers represented far more than success on paper. Each enemy destroyed meant bombers survived, crews lived to fly again, and strategic targets were leveled. The P-47 steadfast protection allowed the daylight bombing campaign to cripple German industry and hasten the end of the war. Individual records echoed that triumph. Gabreski's 28 kills, Johnson's 27, David Schilling's 22 3/4, and Walker Bud Mahurin's 21, all came in Thunderbolts. Every ace credited Zemke's doctrine and months of disciplined training. Across all theaters, the P-47 flew over 746,000 sorties, achieving an overall 4.6 to 1 aerial victory ratio while losing 3,499 aircraft to all causes. Units that strictly followed the high-altitude diving doctrine achieved ratios between 8 to 1 and 15 to 1. Those that strayed from it or fought at low altitude saw far less success. The Thunderbolt's brilliance was rooted in its design, a mechanical triumph by Alexander Kartveli and his Republic aviation team. The P-47D variant, standard across most combat groups, measured 40 feet 9 inches wingspan, 36 feet 1 inch length, and 14 feet 8 inches height, with a combat weight between 14,000 and 17,500 pounds depending on external stores. It could reach 433 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, with a rate of climb around 2,700 feet per minute at sea level, numbers that made the Jug not only the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war, but one of its most formidable and enduring legends. At high altitude, the P-47's performance improved further thanks to its turbocharger. Its service ceiling reached 42,000 feet, and with external fuel tanks, its combat radius extended to about 460 miles, enough for deep escort missions into central Germany. Armament consisted of 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, 4 per wing, each carrying 425 rounds for a total of 3,400, enough for roughly 30 seconds of continuous fire. In practice, Thunderbolt pilots fired in short, controlled bursts of 1 to 3 seconds, allowing ammunition for 10 to 15 engagements. Each .50 caliber round weighed about 1.7 ounces and, with armor-piercing incendiary properties, could tear through aluminum skin, rupture fuel tanks, damage engines, and kill pilots at over 500 yards. Power came from the Pratt & Whitney R2800-59 engine, an 18-cylinder, double-row radial displacing 2,804 cubic inches. At rated power, it delivered 2,000 horsepower at 2,700 RPM, and with water-methanol injection, known as war emergency power, it could reach 2,300 horsepower for 5 minutes. This immense output turned a 12-foot 2-inch Curtiss electric 4-blade propeller, which at high speed approached transonic tip velocity, producing a distinctive roar and vibration that warned pilots of nearing compressibility limits. The P-47's turbocharger system was its most advanced feature, a General Electric Type B11 turbo supercharger mounted in the rear fuselage, harnessed exhaust from all 18 cylinders to spin a turbine at up to 21,300 RPM. The turbine powered a centrifugal compressor that maintained sea-level air density at 30,000 feet. Compressed air then passed through an intercooler to reduce temperature and increase density before entering the engine's mechanical supercharger for final compression. This two-stage setup allowed the R2800 to sustain full rated power to 27,000 feet, far beyond the limits of conventional engines. Structurally, the Thunderbolt was a marvel of strength. Its main wing spar could absorb over 8 GS positive and 3.5 GS negative. Fuselage bulkheads and longerons were designed to protect the pilot even in severe crashes. Armor protection included a 69-pound headrest, AA quarter-inch plate behind the seat, a 3/8-inch engine shield, and bullet-resistant windscreen glass. The self-sealing fuel tanks, built from layered rubberized fabric, would swell when punctured, closing holes to prevent catastrophic leaks. All these engineering choices produce an aircraft perfectly suited to high-altitude, energy-based combat. The P-47 could climb to 30,000 feet, dive from above at unmatched speed, absorb tremendous damage, and still zoom climb back to safety for another attack. This attack cycle could be repeated until either fuel or ammunition ran out. German pilots faced impossible decisions: climb to meet the Thunderbolts, where American turbocharged engines dominated, lure them lower, where the P-47s refused to follow, or avoid combat entirely and concede control of the skies. The strategic implications were immense. The Luftwaffe collapse in 1944 stemmed partly from the relentless attrition inflicted by P-47s and other Allied fighters. German pilot training could no longer keep pace with losses. New recruits, barely trained, became easy prey for experienced American airmen. By spring 1944, the average U.S. pilot in frontline service had far more hours, both in the air and in combat, than his German counterpart. Experience, superior machinery, and refined tactics combined to create an unbridgeable gulf in capability. The results were visible across Europe. The Allied bombing campaign systematically dismantled Germany's war economy, crippling its oil, aircraft, and ball-bearing industries and paralyzing its transportation network. This was possible only because fighters like the P-47 secured air superiority, making daylight bombing feasible. The Thunderbolt's mastery of diving, or boom and zoom, tactics was a decisive factor in that success. The lessons endured long after the war. Post-war analyses confirmed that energy tactics, attacking from altitude with superior speed and managing energy instead of turning, were inherently more effective than close-quarters dogfighting. The next generation of jet fighters carried these lessons forward. The F-86 Sabre, victor of the Korean skies, and the F-100 Super Sabre that followed both prioritized speed, climb rate, and energy retention over turn radius. Francis Gaby Gabreski himself flew F-86 Sabres in Korea, applying the same principles he had mastered in his Thunderbolt days. He shot down 6.5 MiG-15s, becoming one of only 7 American pilots ever to achieve A status in 2 wars. The tactics that once defeated the FW-190 now brought victory over the jet age. And Bf-109s over Germany worked just as effectively against MiG-15s in Korea. The rule never changed: maintain altitude advantage, dive at high speed, fire a quick burst, then zoom climb back to safety. The aircraft evolved, the speeds doubled, but the principle endured. German airmen captured after the war often described the P-47's diving attacks as the most terrifying experience imaginable. Oberleutnant Heinz-Kurt Heinz, who surrendered in March 1945 after years of combat and several shootdowns, told Allied interrogators that the Thunderbolt's reputation was psychological as much as physical. You would be climbing toward the bombers, he said, and suddenly your wingman would vanish in a flash. You would look up and see American fighters diving straight down at impossible speeds. Before you could react, they were already climbing away, untouchable. You could not chase them up. You could not escape them down. You could only pray they picked someone else next time. Modern flight simulations using original data confirm what those pilots learned in blood. When the P-47 maintained altitude discipline and struck only in diving attacks, kill ratios routinely exceeded 20-1 against comparable German fighters. Only when Thunderbolt pilots broke doctrine, fighting low and turning instead of diving, did the Luftwaffe regain the edge. The lesson was clear. Tactics built on real performance always defeat tactics built on wishful thinking. The P-47 was never the most agile fighter, nor the best climber below 20,000 feet, nor the longest-range escort until late models arrived. But it was the fastest diver, the toughest to kill, and the most powerful at high altitude. When flown to those strengths, it achieved results unmatched by any other piston-engine fighter of the war. The 56 fighter group's record remains one of the finest tactical achievements in aviation history. They took an aircraft marked as too heavy and clumsy, studied its true behavior, and built doctrine around its strengths while avoiding its flaws. They trained until precision became instinct. They held formation under unimaginable stress. The outcome was mastery of Europe's skies and the survival of thousands of bomber crews who lived to see the war's end because of Thunderbolts diving from the stratosphere. Colonel Hubert Zemke, who led the 56 through its formative period, later recalled in his memoir, "When I took command in 1942, everyone said the P-47 was wrong for the job, and my men feared they'd be slaughtered. I had to find out what it could really do. The dive became everything. We could dive faster than anyone, recover from dive that would kill others, and climb back up to do it again. Once we mastered that, nothing could stop us." By war's end, the P-47 stood among history's most effective fighters. Its 746,000 sorties and 4.6-1 overall kill ratio told only part of the story. The 56 fighter group's internal numbers, an 11-1 air combat ratio, 5.3-1 including every operational loss, revealed what disciplined execution could achieve. Pilots who truly mastered the dive posted astonishing records. Gabreski's 28 victories in 166 missions, Johnson's 27 in 91, Schilling's 22 3/4 in 132, averaging nearly 1 victory for every 4 missions flown. Such results were once thought impossible to sustain. The saga of the P-47 and its vertical tactics is a parable of analysis over assumption, discipline over bravado, and physics over tradition. Every expert in 1943 knew that heavy fighters couldn't win against light, nimble ones. Every textbook since 1918 insisted that turning and climbing decided dogfights. Every pilot wanted the smallest, twitchiest aircraft. Then a handful of Americans led by Zemke climbed to 30,000 feet in the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built, rolled inverted, shoved a stick forward, and discovered that every rule was wrong. Straight down at 500 miles per hour was the fastest path to victory. The zoom climb back to altitude, the safest defense ever devised. They proved that understanding an aircraft's real performance mattered more than mythology. The Luftwaffe never forgot the lesson, and neither did the Americans who flew those missions. Historians shouldn't forget it either. The Thunderbolt story shows how disciplined thinking turned supposed weakness into overwhelming strength. The pilots dove straight down because analysis showed it worked, and kept diving because combat confirmed it. They achieved kill ratios near 20-1 because physics and doctrine outweighed legend and impulse. That is how air superiority is won. That is how bombers reach their targets and return home. That is how outnumbered pilots survive against seasoned foes. You study your machine's truths. You craft tactics that exploit them. You train until every action is automatic. You hold discipline even when instinct says to fight differently. You roll inverted at 30,000 feet, point your nose toward Earth, accelerate past 500 miles per hour, fire short bursts, and pull up into the sun. Do it precisely. Do it together, and no enemy can touch you. That was a revelation the 56 fighter group forged through months of relentless experimentation and combat. That was a tactical revolution that reshaped aerial warfare and secured Allied command of the skies. That was why P-47 pilots dove straight down, and why, under ideal conditions, they achieved kill ratios approaching 20-1. The secret was never just courage or superior hardware. It was a marriage of science, discipline, and willpower, a combination that proved utterly unstoppable.